All right. So in full disclosure, I have worked with Genentech a bit on consulting as they were putting together the clinical trials that then eventually led to Hemlibra. I'm going to talk a lot about Hemlibra and emicizumab. So, but I'm not employed by them. I do get some grant funding from them, so that's full disclosure. But I'm doing a lot of consultancies with a lot of companies because we want to make sure that the clinical trials are done right. And I think we need to think about you guys. What data do you need that makes a difference for you? So that's what we're trying to wave into the clinical trials. So we'll talk.
And one question about that, Rebecca. I know the answer to this, so I'm going to ask it is it pretty common for hemophilia, like heads of an HTC, to consult with drug companies?
Everybody does.
Yeah. So just kind of putting that out there just because it just is what it is.
Yeah.
Hemophilia.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you always have to ask, what is this consultancy? Am I giving talks for them? Am I a consultant to set up a clinical trial? Am I a consultant to tell them, well, how should they market? So I am not doing any marketing consulting because that's up to them. I don't care. It's like I just want to make sure that we get good, solid clinical trial data that are meaningful, that are fair. So that's my function in life, and that's my involvement. So we're going to talk quite a bit about emicizumab. I have about 20, 30 minutes of slides, and what I want to do is give you the most up-to-date data. So this is data that was presented on last Monday at the World Federation meeting in Glasgow. So I know that none of you have seen this before because this is really, really, truly hot off the press. So we're going to focus a lot on this data that just came out. I have a little bit on gene therapy, on an extra, and on another extended half-life factor, but we're going to spend a lot of time on emicizumab. Mm-hmm.
The approval process, did it first happen in the EU?
Yeah, I'll talk about that. This is also meant to be super informal because you're here because you have questions, you have concerns, and I want to be able to answer that. So interrupt me at any time and say, I don't understand that, I'm really worried about this, I have heard in the community, blah, blah, blah. There is no question that's off the table here. So, but emicizumab, initially known as ACE910, a lot of you have heard, then it was called emicizumab, and now it's licensed under Hemlibra. Just wanted to show a little bit about when does this, actually the whole project around emicizumab started in 2002. That's when they started to look for a bispecific antibody, and they screened, they had the first lead in 2008, was identified that meant they had 40,000 candidates that they had to screen. They almost gave up, and the company said, you have one more day, you've been working on this for way too long, you're not finding anything, we give you one more day, and that day they found the lead that then turned out to be emicizumab. So, and since then they've done all the clinical trials, and finally in 2017 we got approval of Hemlibra for inhibitor patients in the United States, and Europe got approval, and Japan got approval in early 2018. For inhibitors only. What I'm going to show you though is the non-inhibitor data that we're all interested. So how does that fit in for people without inhibitors? So what is emicizumab? Just to get, a lot of you may know but may not know, so I want to get everybody up to speed. What does factor VIII do? Factor VIII is one of the many clotting proteins we have, and factor VIII, they all have to play together. So factor VIII in general brings activated factor IX and factor X in close proximity, and when they're close, then this factor X can get activated and then eventually make a clot. So that is what factor VIII does. So if you don't have factor VIII because you have severe hemophilia, or if you have an inhibitor, then you don't have that factor VIII that can do that. So the idea was, well, can we make this bispecific antibody So that's what this guy is. We all have antibodies. Antibodies are floating around and they recognize bacteria and viruses and lots of things. So we have this part we all have, and then we have these regions on the arms that recognize maybe a specific virus. So if we get a vaccine, what we do is we train antibodies in our body to make these little arms to recognize certain viruses, and that's how a vaccine works. So what they did is they wanted to train an antibody or find an antibody that can recognize activated factor 9 and factor 10, and then do the same thing that factor 8 does by bringing them together. And then the thought is, well, can that then lead to a clot? And indeed it does. So you can use that in the absence of factor 8, and it works. So that's been shown in animal models and then in early trials in humans, and it seems to be working, so that's why it went into these big clinical trials. The nice thing about this is that it has a very long half-life. What's the half-life of factor 8?
8 to 12 hours. 8 to 12 hours.
Right. So not very long, and that's why you have to take it over and over and over again. So this is 4 to 5 weeks. So whatever I take today, half of it is still going to be around in a month. So this really stays in your system for a long time. So rather than doing this when you're taking factor, you can take something like that and you kind of stay up. Yeah.
How does the transfer process work for that?
The transfer process, how do you take it?
Yeah, how do you take it?
So you don't have to. So you don't have to take it through a vein. You can
okay.
take it subcutaneously. So you just inject it into some fat tissue, just like a diabetes shot. It's a small, tiny needle, right? Easy to take. So, and the nice thing is that if you have inhibitors against factor 8, it doesn't matter because this is not factor 8. So these inhibitors you have against factor 8 do not recognize this antibody. So it works even in people who have inhibitors. So that's what it's approved for. But it should also work in people that don't have inhibitors, right?
What about people who had past inhibitors?
Yep. Those are also people, would it be working in them?
It wouldn't?
Well, it should, right?
It should, okay.
So and that's the data I'm going to show you. So the clinical trials for this product that have been done so far are known as the Haven 1, 2, 3, and 4 trials. The Haven 1 and 2 were done in inhibitor patients, over 12 and less than 12. And they were very, very positive trials showing that the emicizumab is giving much, much better protection for bleeding than any bypassing prophylaxis or if you're not on prophylaxis. So based on that, the FDA and the European and Japanese agencies have approved this product for use. So, and I would say just about all of our inhibitor patients are now on that and doing well. So the big question here, how about that Haven 3? This is the study in the non-inhibitor patients. Does it work? Does it not work? And that's the data I'm going to show you. And then they also wanted to show in the Haven 4, can this actually be given every 4 weeks? Because right now it's given every week. But can we actually take it every 2 weeks, or can we take it every 4 weeks? Wouldn't that be nice? A little tiny shot once a month?
Excuse me, you said right now it's given every week?
Yep.
Even though they're shown to have a half-life of 4 to 5 weeks?
So they just give a smaller dose, and I'll show you some of the slides that kind of may, so you just take a smaller dose to kind of stay in more of a steady state.
Okay. What kind of levels are you looking to maintain, like plus 50%?
So this is a really, really good question. So you cannot really measure factor 8 levels of that because it's not factor 8, right? It acts like it, but so I'm going way off there, but so the normal clotting assays, the factor 8, cannot be determined in a test tube like we used to. So if you do a factor 8 level, you're going to get, on this product, you're going to get something like 400%. But that is not a true level. That doesn't mean functionally that that's actually what it does. It's just that's what the interaction in the test tube is,
Okay.
if that makes any sense. So, but the equivalent, what we think we get to with this steady state is probably a factor 8 equivalent of about 15 to 30%.
Okay.
So not complete correction. You can still bleed, but you're taking somebody from severe hemophilia to mild
Oh,
hemophilia.
yeah, okay,
Okay?
okay.
All right, so let's take a look at that data. And like I said, this was presented last Monday. This was a huge clinical trial in hemophilia without inhibitors. These are all the 39 sites that participated worldwide.
You're on it.
Yeah, and we're here. So, yeah, we were one of the major enrolling sites.
Is there a Boston State too?
No, I don't think so. There's one in Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Michigan. Anyway, so how did this work? What did we want to compare? So this was a phase 3 trial, and the phase 3 trial is really, really important in getting a drug approved. If we have a new drug, we need to show that this new drug is actually doing better or as good as what's the standard of care. And what's the standard of care for hemophilia? Factor VIII prophylaxis, right? That's what we do to prevent bleeding. So that's what they wanted to compare. So we have people that get randomized because we don't want any bias in there and say, oh, you know, it's like you're doing really well, so I think I'm going to put you in that group and I'm going to put somebody else in the other group. So we have two groups. We have people getting emicizumab or people that are not getting any prophylaxis to show what does it work as a prophylaxis. But we also had this where people were on prophylaxis before and then they got emicizumab and we compared them to themselves to see, is it working better than no prophylaxis? Probably. But is it also working better than prophylaxis? And that's the data. So there were two arms. One of the arms, like I said, were people that were not taking prophylaxis right now, even though they probably should have, but for whatever reason they were not taking it. And then they were randomized, and either they got the emicizumab weekly, once a week, or they got the emicizumab every 2 weeks. Yeah?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So currently the way it goes with the prophylaxis is, you know, you're doing the infusions either daily, every other day, whatever the regimen is. And then you're also having to take more per incident.
Mm-hmm.
With this,
Yeah. So in this clinical trial, whether you came in on this arm because you were not on prophylaxis and you were randomized to one of those, if you had a bleed, you would treat like you always did before.
okay.
So if you were on the emicizumab and you had a bleed, you would take factor VIII. If you were in this arm where you're not taking anything and you had a bleed, you would treat with factor VIII. If you were in this arm, that I'm going to show next here, say, and you were on factor VIII prophylaxis before, they had this non-interventional study where people had to electronically log every bleed they had for 24 weeks. So it's not just, how many bleeds did I have over the last 6 months? Well, maybe did I have 1 or 5 or 7 or I don't remember. So they really looked at it and people got this diary to take home and they had to log their bleed. So we really, really, really know how much they bled in the 6 months before they went on the emicizumab. But again, if they were on the prophylaxis and they had a bleed, they would treat it with factor VIII. And when they then later on switched to the emicizumab and stopped their factor VIII prophylaxis, if they had a bleed, they would treat with factor VIII. So the nice thing about this is that the factor VIII and the emicizumab are competing for the same target, right? So the factor VIII wants to find the activated 9 and the 10 and wants to bind to them. The emicizumab wants to do the same thing. So the question is, who's stronger? The factor VIII is stronger. So if you have both in the system, the factor VIII is going to win. They're going to bind. And the emicizumab is going to be pushed to the side, and it's going to hang out there until the factor VIII is gone again, and then it goes back in.
One way or the other, it optimizes the performance of the clotting agents.
Exactly. So, but what's important to know with this is that it's not additive. So you're not putting somebody at risk for clotting by treating a bleed while they're on emicizumab. Because if you're doing your regular factor VIII dose of 50 units per kilogram, which is 100% corrective dose, you can go ahead and give that because it just pushes the emicizumab to the side for a little while. And just when the factor VIII is back gone, then the Emi goes back in. Does that make sense?
Actually, it does, yeah. Because
So-
the factor has a much higher
Binding.
half-life.
Yeah, well, the factor VIII has a shorter half-life, but it has higher affinity. So it's the stronger binder. It's tight,
It
tight,
works
tight.
better, but as soon as it goes away, the other steps
Exactly.
in.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
Oh, that's
So, but
good.
that's an important concept to know because we want to make sure that we're not giving too much clotting agent because we don't want you guys to be having clotting complications. So, but it's safe to treat with factor VIII while you're on meds.
It's not with other medications.
Not with other medications. For inhibitors, that's very different, and you know that. So for inhibitors, because the bypassing agents are not pushing the emicizumab out of the way, and they're acting somewhere else, you're adding clot antibody that clears the drug. So this is much, much, much lower. Any questions on emicizumab?
So my question is, the patient with no inhibitor with factor VIII, after we take
Emicizumab, 8, 9, 10, Hemlibra.
yeah, and then the body develop antibody with that. When they go back to factor VIII, they're gonna develop antibody to
Factor VIII? No, not necessarily, because it's a completely different. So if you have taken a lot of factor VIII, usually the immune system says, yep, that's okay. So if you develop an antibody or an inhibitor against factor VIII, usually that happens early in life. When the immune system all of a sudden says, when people are children, it goes, hey, hang on, it's like, that's not mine. I don't make that. This is foreign. I need to make a response against it, and then I make an antibody. So if people have gotten a lot of factor VIII before and they're alive, then that's much less likely to happen, because then at some point the body said, okay, I'll accept that protein, that's okay. So it's not completely foreign. So it's less likely that that's going to happen. But certainly something that we are thinking about and worrying about, because what if you have a newborn child with hemophilia that have never gotten anything? Would it not be great if I could put them on emicizumab, they get a little subcutaneous injection once a week, maybe once a month, and they're not going to bleed. And now they fall down the stairs, and now I have to give them factor VIII. And maybe they're 2 years old now or 3 years old now, and now I have to give them a lot of factor VIII because they are just proceeding into their head. Do they then develop a factor VIII inhibitor because they've never been exposed to factor? So those are questions that we really need to address before we put people on emicizumab that have never gotten factor VIII. Does that make sense?
How do you test for an inhibitor when they're on an emicizumab?
Emicizumab, that's a really, really good question. It's difficult. Well, there are tests where, because the emicizumab interferes with the testing we have right now. So there are specialized inhibitor tests that we're going to have to start. We offer them at Bloodworks, and we have to think about, are there certain labs in the country that are going to offer them? But you can actually detect an inhibitor. And I think when you're on emicizumab and you had an inhibitor before or not, I mean, we still need to check for that inhibitor, and I do it once a year still, to make sure that that factor VIII inhibitor doesn't pop up in something.
But what about an inhibitor to
Yeah.
emicizumab? It's
Yeah.
the same thing.
Same thing.
Thank you.
Do you expect inhibitors to the emicizumab to appear at the same time that they have the factor VIII?
I expect it, but I don't know. Usually, typically, the immune system is such that if something's relatively new, the first time it sees it, it goes, don't really know what to think about that. The second time it goes, don't know what to do about that. And then you do a couple more times, and by the 7th or 9th time, the immune system goes, hey, this is not mine. I'm going to start making an antibody. That's less likely to happen if that factor emicizumab has been there 100 times At that point, the immune system says, fine, let it go. I know that one. So my assumption is we're gonna see the same thing.
So do you see this going for moderates and milds and for females and for factor nines?
So that's another really, really good question. And that's one that we posed because the question is, does it work? I told you that factor VIII binds much more tightly than emicizumab. So if I have somebody who's mild, who has maybe factor VIII level of 15% to begin with, that factor VIII is always going to bind. Can the emicizumab do anything on top of that? And I think we need to test it. I think that's the next clinical trial that needs to happen.
For milds, right?
For milds or
Because they're
moderates.
starting
So
out.
I don't know, at what point, how high can your intrinsic, your own factor VIII level be, and you could still get benefit?
Or do you just use a smaller dose?
Well, that's the, I don't know. I mean, because I need to overcome that. We don't know. So, but that's an excellent question and one that a lot of hemophilia treaters have posed and said, hey, we need a trial on that because wouldn't that be great if I can give it to symptomatic carriers, if I can give it to miles, how high can I go?
I want to know.
What about von
You will-
Willebrand's? That's so closely
Also
associated
an
with that.
excellent question. So I mean, you're hitting all the big. We have had several advisory boards for Genentech to say what's the next study, what do we need to know, and both of these things came up. What do we do with miles? What do we do with carrier females? What do we do with von Willebrand? Can it happen there? Also, a question: Can it work in acquired hemophilia?
The cost ratio between taking your normal factor VIII prophylaxis compared to this new product called.
So that's, and I have to give Genentech some credit here because they could have made this a lot more, I mean, this is expensive. This is super, super, super expensive. This is gonna cost $450,000 a year. But they could have made it cost a lot more. They could have made it cost twice as much because that's what bypassing agent prophylaxis costs. So what they said is, what does good solid factor VIII prophylaxis cost? And that's about where the price is. So the price is about the same.
For normal factor VIII. For normal factor VIII.
For normal factor VIII. And it's definitely cheaper for integration.
Theoretically, based on what you said before about factor VIII being more dominant than the flux, you would think in these mild hemophilia cases, emicizumab wouldn't do anything.
That's the question. So, I mean, how much emicizumab can I give? Can I then overcome? Because if I have factor VIII level of 5%, then I only have so much. There's still going to be some receptors or some factor 9 and 10 that's floating around that nobody's binding to. And can the emicizumab help with those? And overall, you prevent bleeding. But we don't know.
But if you're doing regular stuff, like you said, you do not increase emicizumab higher when somebody has a bleed.
Well, because it doesn't, so that's, because it doesn't work fast enough, right? So you're giving the emicizumab, if you're giving something into the vein, the chronic factor, it gets to where it needs to go in seconds. If I give something subcutaneous, it needs to be absorbed, it needs to get in the blood, it needs to be distributed, so that takes from the time you give it for it to get into your bloodstream is probably a day and a half or so.
Have you tried doing emicizumab directly? Just like you have to week long Have you tried doing directly for emicizumab?
They haven't yet, but there's, we're talking about it because can we use it as a bleeding treatment? And there's a lot of interest. Theoretically, yes, we can, but it just hasn't been done yet. It has been done in monkeys and it works, but we haven't done it in humans. Oh, I'll come.
Not that it would, the great part is the sub-Q part of it, but if you administered the emicizumab intravenously, would it work faster?
That's the question. Yes, it should, because then it gets to where it needs to go right away. That has not been tested yet. It has been tested in monkeys, but not in humans. So there's definitely interest in testing that from the drug company. So, but we need a trial to make sure it's safe.
It's the matter transport, that's what I'm
Yeah, exactly. So I mean,
How fast
I
is
mean,
something getting
yeah, I mean, you know, it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. Do you need it to treat a bleed, then you need an immediate onset, or do you need it to prevent bleeding? Then you can put it in that little fat reservoir, and then it takes longer to get there, but it also gives you these nice steady states. And we're trying to get away from IV, right? Or does anybody want to stick with IV? So, what's happening with factor VIII? Should we switch both? And then, I mean, we can still ask that. So this was really exciting that I wanted to share with you that was also presented at the WFH on Monday. We know we have the regular factor VIII, but we have this extended half-life factor, right? The aloctate, dynamate, they're all now coming out and they have longer half-life. So these are our traditional half-lives. There are some where I think it might be a little bit of an overestimation, but it's about 8 to 12 hours. And then these new ways of extending the half-life. These are all kinds of different products. There are some of them are on the market, some of them not quite yet, but they're getting there. So we see that the half-life is a little bit better, but it's really not that great, right? So it's giving us a little bit. Here is another product that you probably want to know about. So this is very early, but if this is your factor VIII molecule, you know we have these subunits in there, and they have to bind to different things. So we have these A and these C subunits, the blue one is the factor VIII. And we know that if that gets chaperoned by the von Willebrand factor. Von Willebrand factor we need for the factor VIII to stay in the circulation longer. It's kind of a protective molecule. So the ideal as well, if I bind them together more, so that they bind more tightly to the von Willebrand, is the half-life then longer. Then we have this FC molecule that has been shown in one of the factors that's now available on the market. That prolongs the half-life. So if I do both, and then if I have this X10, which is kind of this hydrophilic sequence that were a factor VIII before they got on the ME, they were kind of, their annualized bleeding rate was kind of where all those other clinical trials had been, and here you see again that reduction. You see that with the median, and you also, when you're looking at people that had no bleeding at all, on all those trials, that's kind of what we had before. In our non-interventional study, we had about 40% that didn't have any bleeding, and that went up to 60%. So 60% of the patients in the clinical trial had zero bleeding. This is the target joint. Somebody was asking about that. The target joint bleeding, if they were on prior episodic, so they were not on prophylaxis, we had 85% had target joint bleeding. On emicizumab, that went down to 4.2%, so a lot less target joint bleeding. And we saw the same thing. This is on prophylaxis. 41% of them had target joint bleeding in the 6 months, and on emicizumab, only 3.2%. So target joints also look better. So then I ask people, well, what's your preference? And because this is clinical trial data, that's one thing. These are numbers that we're pushing around. But how does the patient feel? So they were asked, would you prefer your old hemophilia treatment? That was the intravenous. Did you feel better on that? Did you feel like you had better protection? Whatever, so would you like to stay on that? Or would you prefer the emicizumab treatment that's subcutaneous? Or do you not have any preference at all? So altogether, 70% of people finished that questionnaire. Some people just didn't answer it, and it was all patients. And of all the questionnaires, 93.7% of people said they preferred the emicizumab over the factor VIII. I mean, it's not hard to imagine, but here are also the numbers. So what about the people that were on, I mean, you could say, well, that's easy. If I'm not taking factor before, and all of a sudden I'm not bleeding anymore, of course I'm going to prefer it. But what about the people that were on prophylaxis? So of the people that were on prophylaxis with factor VIII, 97.8% of people preferred the emicizumab. So,
You mentioned earlier you compared both of them. You said taking normal factor VIII prophylaxis is much more solitude, stronger.
well, no, it
Not strongly
binds
said.
more strongly,
Binds
but
more
we
strongly.
saw more bleeding in the people on factor VIII prophylaxis than on the emicizumab prophylaxis. So the emicizumab prophylaxis seems to give more protection from bleeding. Right?
I have a question.
Yeah.
And this is a real rookie question, but since the current dose of emicizumab only goes to 15 to 30, or not, shouldn't say only, because it's still really wonderful, but is there a correlation? Can you go higher in that?
That's an excellent
Okay.
question. That's a really good question. So why only go to 15 or 30%? Why can't we just make this normal?
Or get more?
So, right. So why was it set up that way? In the first trial, when they first gave the emicizumab to human beings, they said, well, usually it's called a phase 1 trial, and we start with a little dose, and then we go up on the dose, and we go up a little higher, and we go up a little higher to make sure that people are not having bad reactions to it. So they did it, and they did the very first dose, and everybody was doing fine, but they still saw some bleeding. So they went up a little bit, and people were still doing fine, and they didn't have much bleeding anymore at all. And then they went even up higher, and people were tolerating it, but they still had no bleeding. So they said, well, let's go for the clinical trial, let's be safe, let's take that dose in the middle. Because a clinical trial, I mean, this, you saw how many sites are there. This is in the entire world. How many millions and millions of dollars do you think they paid to do this trial?
Yeah.
Many, many, many $million to be at all these sites, to have the drug at all these sites, to monitor everybody. So they wanted to make sure that this drug gets approved. So if the drug is safe and it's not causing any problems, and maybe it's going to show benefit, then it's going to get approved.
Right.
If I have a drug that shows benefit, that has one complication, it might get pulled. So they wanted, it's the safe zone. So the big question is, can we actually push it? Can we get more out of it? I don't know. We all don't know. There were a few patients, very, very few patients on the Haven 1 study in the inhibitors where we had to increase the dose. So we doubled the dose, but patients didn't really do all that much better. So if you're thinking that the emicizumab dose for the inhibitor patients right now costs about $450,000 a year, which, you know, if you treat as bypassing agent prophylaxis, it's $1 million. So altogether, it's cheaper. This is for inhibitor patients. So, and this, the $450,000 is probably about where factor VIII prophylaxis would be. So, if now all of a sudden you say, well, this person had a bleed, and let's see whether it can go up in the dose, I'm going to double the dose. Well, now it's $900,000 a year. So the insurance company may have something to say about that.
Well, it seems like, because the initial dose is 1.5 per kilo, and the second dose for the
Is
3 to
3.
4 was 3, and you got longer time between doses, but it didn't seem like you got anything higher than your...
Well, I'm actually going to show that in
Okay.
the next few slides, so you kind of see how that goes up and down a little bit. But those are, so they're tolerated well, and I'm getting more drug level, but overall, am I going to get more factor VIII equivalent level?
Right.
And that's hard to say because we don't know how to measure that really well. But anyway, so safety, people did quite well in that. So what we want to, and this is again a busy slide, the number one side effect was slight injection site reactions. A little bit of redness, nobody discontinued the drug because of it. Not always, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But that was the number one related side effect. Other than that, we didn't see any serious adverse effects that were related to the drug.
Can you switch back and forth with your
The factor VIII?
Yeah, your factor VIII prophylaxis and with this.
Well, you could, but that's really expensive and you don't really need it. Yeah.
Just stay on one and then treat the
I mean, you can always treat it, well, I mean, you can treat with your factor VIII. Yeah. I mean, if you're already doing better. So, so anyway, so really important in this trial, so we had, and I'll talk about the side effects we had in the inhibitor trials, but we did not see any of those side effects in this trial. So there were no serious adverse events, and we did, in this trial, we did not see any antibodies against emicizumab. So that's important, because obviously we're concerned about that. So well tolerated. So, with that, I want to switch over to that Haven 4 trial. Can we actually take these every 4 weeks? Can we take it every 2 weeks? Seems like taking it every 2 weeks gave us, the prophylaxis was as effective, right? So can we do it every 4 weeks? Wouldn't that be great? So this comes to your modeling. So if you were taking, initially, on all of these, you take 3 milligrams per kilogram as a loading dose in 4 doses, to kind of build it up weekly. And then after that, if you give 1.5 milligram per kilogram, which is half the dose, you give that once a week just for a little booster, you kind of go into this kind of steady state. Yeah, there's still some peaks and troughs a little bit, but they don't mean much anymore. So you kind of really get into this steady state thing here. If you're taking it every 2 weeks, you go up a little bit higher, you go down a little bit higher, but you're still in this overall very safe range, right? So the question was, well, what do we do if we take it every 4 weeks? Yeah, we have more peaks and troughs right here, but does it really matter? So that's an ongoing trial, but they wanted to see, this was their modeling, they wanted to see, is this really what's going to happen if I take it every 4 weeks? So this is what they saw, and again, these are the troughs. So they're drawn, that's the drug level right before the next dose is due. And in blue you see the weekly, in green you see the every 2 weeks, and in orange here, this is the trial that's still ongoing, it's every 4 weeks. And what we really are concerned, we don't want to slip below that 40 line here, because an equivalent of the concentration of 40 is about that factor VIII equivalent of 15 to 30% that we're targeting, and you see that they're not slipping below that. So it seems like hopefully that's going to be an alternative. So if somebody really wants to take it once a month, you can potentially do that. How great would it be to be on prophylaxis once a month?
Is the dose 4 times a month in treatment, or
Yeah,
is it the same?
it is. So altogether, you're giving the same dose over time. Okay? All right, what about side effects? And I know that there's a lot of talk in the community, so if you have any questions, please ask me. But I was going to talk a little bit about, probably heard about these people that died, and so I just wanted to talk a little bit about why did they die, and did the emicizumab have anything to do with it? So there were 5 people, and they were all people with inhibitors that died. One of them was on that clinical trial. One of them was somebody who entered the study after the primary analysis, and that was called the expanded access. So people that were taken on the clinical trial after the trial was already kind of done, but because they really wanted to be on the emicizumab. And there were 3 people that were getting emicizumab on compassionate use. What does that mean? What is compassionate use? Compassionate use means if I have a desperate situation, I have a patient who's bleeding, and I have tried every clotting agent that's available to me, and I have nothing else left, and I still have this patient that's bleeding, that I go to a drug company and I say, I know you're developing this product, please give it to me, I have somebody who's dying. So that's compassionate use, and then drug companies will sometimes give us clotting factor or their product so we can give it to a patient so we can hopefully prevent that person from dying. So So that's what compassionate use is, and that's really important to understand because that means that these were 3 people that were in desperate trouble. These were people that were bleeding and nothing that we had available was stopping that bleeding. So these 3 people eventually died, even though they got the emicizumab. But does that mean that the emicizumab killed them? No. It was the situation that they were in a really bad, there were 2 people that had ongoing intracranial hemorrhages that just, they had one intracranial hemorrhage after a head bleed, one after the other. There was probably something in the vasculature in their brain that made them bleed. Nothing they got before, none of the clotting agents that are available was stopping the bleeding. So when they got the emicizumab, that didn't help either. Is it the fault of the emicizumab? Probably not. So I think that's what we need to understand when people are out there and saying, yeah, but 5 people died on this. It was not necessarily the fault. Actually, all 5 of those from the investigator, from the physicians that were treating these patients said the emicizumab had nothing to do with it. It was just a bad situation. This guy here in the clinical trial, he was a patient who had a bleed. He had a colon surgery, and he was bleeding from that surgery. He was bleeding, and he was getting all the clotting agents that we have available, and it wouldn't stop the bleed. This was a patient who refused to get any blood transfusions for personal reasons, and he eventually died because he didn't have enough blood. Was it the emicizumab that killed him? No, probably not. It was just nothing in the world was going to stop that bleed.
What year did this took place in the patient?
This death was either, I think it was in 16 or 17. It was in 16. Yeah.
No, wait, I'm sorry.
17, right?
2017.
I think it was in 17. I mean, it was during the Haven one study. It could have been early. I think
It's one of
it
the
was early
compassionate
17.
use intracranial hemorrhages was 2016.
Right, yeah, exactly. So that was in 16. I think this was in 17. There was one more reason. There was one in 2 in 17 and one in 16. And this one was also in 17.
The compassionate use, were there more than 3 people?
That's a really good question. I don't know.
Philosophical question.
No. I mean, no, I don't know. I don't know how many people have gotten it compassionately. So 5 fatalities. One of these patients was in the U.S. The other ones were outside of the U.S. All of them were deemed to be unrelated to the study product. So there's that rectal hemorrhage that happened here. One of those patients had sepsis, so they died of that. One of them died of an intracranial hemorrhage. Sorry, that's the sequence operation. There was a rectal hemorrhage in there. And then there was a pre-existing pseudotumor. So this is what these people died of. So this was before April 30th. And then since then, there's one more fatality that was recently reported. This was also a compassionate use, and this was in somebody with acquired hemophilia. So this is not congenital hemophilia. This is in somebody else. So people can get acquired hemophilia when it's completely different from congenital hemophilia. It is when people make antibodies against their own factor VIII. So they're born, they make factor VIII, they're fine, and all of a sudden their immune system turns against themselves and they start making antibodies against their own factor VIII. It's super rare. It's very, very problematic because this happens in older patients. So it's very difficult. So anyway, this patient was given emicizumab because, again, they were in a desperate situation. And this patient also died. He died of sudden cardiac death. So nothing, I don't think it was related to this.
And patient that this patient.
It was outside the U.S. and I don't know where. It was not in the U.S. Okay. So what about drug antibodies? Because that's something we always fear. We know that in hemophilia A, we can make antibodies against factor VIII. Can we make antibodies against this emicizumab? How worried do we need to be? So in the phase 1 study, so that was the first study where they just wanted to find the right dose. There were 3 cases that made drug antibodies. So there were 18 patients in that trial and 3 of them made antibodies against, or they found antibodies that were recognizing the drug, but they did not clear the drug. So they're just recognizing it, they're hanging on, and they're circulating with it, and they didn't do anything about it. It's okay, we don't mind, that's okay. Some of us, or I mean, I might have antibodies against factor 8. As long as it doesn't do anything to the factor 8, it's okay, we can recognize it. So nothing what we call drug clearing. Recently, however, there is one patient that had factor 8, that with the factor 8 inhibitor, that was given emicizumab, and after the 4th dose, he developed a drug clearing antibody. So this is the very first case of the over 300 patients that have been getting emicizumab that now has an antibody where the drug doesn't work. So it can happen. It's very rare, but it's something that we need to be aware of. So just to put that into perspective, if you're taking factor 8, 30% of people get agents, and that's why we saw these side effects. Right?
Okay, that
So,
makes sense.
make sense?
But for people without inhibitors, it's the same thing, right? You wouldn't want to use the other clotting agents.
No, and you wouldn't use them anyway
Yeah.
because you don't need to, because factor 8 is missing and you're seeing
Right.
okay? All clear? As much?
Just one other question. So, pre-study episodic factor A is randomized 2 to 1.
Yeah.
So your N of 18 in arm C, did these people just stay on
For
regular,
the-
they're still chasing bleeds?
Yeah, so these were people that were not on prophylaxis before.
Right, because you never take somebody
Worldwide,
off of propane and say,
no,
go back
you
on
would
demand.
never do
Yeah.
that. So these were people that were not taking prophylaxis anyway, and they were randomized. Those 18 people just stayed on what they usually did, and with the electronic diary for 6 months, they would log all their bleeds, and then after that, they were given, after that was the primary analysis, because we wanted to see who's doing better over here and who's doing better over here, and then after that, these people could actually start emicizumab, and they actually all did. Okay. So that's how the study was set up. So let's look a little bit how old were these patients, what were they like. So these were the people, remember, that were randomized. So they were not on anything before. Most of these people in the study were over 18 years old. So it was an adult study. This was not done in children. Most of the people, less than 9 bleeds in the last 24 weeks before. There were relatively few people that had less than 9 bleeds. So these were people that were bleeding quite a bit, which is important.
Because they were treating episodically.
Right. So these were heavy bleeders. Now, when you talk about a clinical trial, you kind of need to know, are we talking about people that are not bleeding to begin with, or are we talking about people that are bleeding quite a bit? And I'll talk about bleed data a little later. So, and most of these people here, 94%, 77%, 83% did have target joints.
I'm
So-
sorry, did or did not?
Did.
Did,
So
okay.
most people were adults, over 18, most of them were bleeding quite a bit, and most of them had target joints. In the prophylaxis, as we would expect, that's a little bit, there were some younger patients. Overall, we had more patients that had less bleeding, and we had fewer patients that had target joints. Makes sense, they're taking prophylaxis. Okay, so let's talk about the drug levels that you were talking about. And this is whether the emicizumab is given every week or whether it's given every 2 weeks. And this is always at the trough. So this is before they take their next dose.
Okay.
Okay? So overall, as you would expect, the people that take it weekly are just a little bit higher because their variation is going to be not as much. And the ones that are every 2 weeks, they're staying up there all the time. So this is about a factor equivalent of about 15 to 30%. So they're staying there all the time. They're not going to the 0, they're not going to 1%, they're not going to 5%, they're not going to 10%. And that is the big thing about the emicizumab that we can do that factor does not. Because with a factor, we always start it down. All right, let's talk. So we do, in hemophilia, we always talk about this ABR, annual bleeding rate. So how many bleeds you have in a year. So these are the people that are now on the prophylaxis with emicizumab once a week, every 2 weeks, and these are the people that are not on prophylaxis. So the people that are not on prophylaxis, on average, they have 38 bleeds in a year. Okay, that's all bleeds. What about the ones on emicizumab weekly? 1.5 bleeds a year. What about the ones on every 2 weeks? 1.3 bleeds a year. So here you go in bars, a lot of bleeding if you don't take prophylaxis, and very, very significant reduction when you're taking emicizumab. Whether that's once a week or every 2 weeks doesn't seem to make a difference. So seems to be working great as a prophylaxis. And if you break this down, and this is a very, very busy slide, but I'll just walk you. So because if we're talking about bleeding, what are we talking about? Are we talking about spontaneous bleeding? Are we talking about bleeding that's just a bruise? Are we talking about bleeding that needs treatment? Are we talking about joint bleeding? What kind of bleeding are we talking about? And if you're talking at all bleeds, that can be a nosebleed, that can be a big bruise, that can be anything whatsoever. We see that people, this is the overall bleeding, and this is the bleeding on emicizumab. So people still may have had a bruise or a nosebleed, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily treated it. What about treated spontaneous bleeding? You know, that was not trauma related. And here you have how many spontaneous bleeds we had if people don't. So they have about, if you are not a prophylaxis, these people had about 50 to 60 bleeds a year that were spontaneous out of nowhere. And close to 0 on the emicizumab. And treated joint bleeds, we had about 26, 27 bleeds in the people who were not protected, and that goes to almost 0 in the emicizumab. And then treated joint bleeds, we have 13 bleeds that were treated in the not protected group, and then to the emicizumab, that goes close to 0 as well. Any questions on that? It's a lot of data there. So this is, so what about those people that were prophylaxis before? Are we really doing better with the emicizumab? I'm sorry, I'm in your way there. No. Are we doing better? What's better? Say, should I be on factor VIII prophylaxis or should I be on emicizumab prophylaxis?
I suspect you'll probably get to it, but I'm wondering, can you replace the factor VIII prophylaxis with?
That's exactly what we did. So in this trial, we took people that were taking good factor VIII prophylaxis, not ones that were skipping all the time, but people that were actually taking their factor VIII prophylaxis they were supposed to. And we monitored them with this electronic device for 6 months to make sure, yep, they're actually really taking their prophylaxis and to catch every bleed they had. And then after 6 months, they were allowed to switch over to the emicizumab weekly. And then we wanted to see, did they do better when they took their factor VIII prophylaxis, or did they do better when they took the emicizumab prophylaxis? And here's the data. So again, we are talking about these annualized bleeding rates. So in the people that were taking factor VIII prophylaxis, on average, they had 4.8 bleeds a year. So still some breakthrough bleeding. What about the emicizumab? On the emicizumab, they had 1.5 bleeds a year.
Those clients, the patients, they had target joints.
Mm-hmm. And I'll get to that, to the target joints as well. So this again in a bar graph here, it's like so 4.8 on good factor VIII prophylaxis. On emicizumab, those same patients went down to a bleeding rate of 1.5. So that is clearly and it's statistically significant a reduction in bleeding.
So on the one that run once a week, did they, for their bleed, did they treat with factor? And which factor did they use?
Whatever factor product they were on before. So any factor 8 should work, whether that is,
And it was their usual dose?
yep, exactly. No difference there. Just if you have a bleed, you treat it. Yep.
So they were doing both, doing their factor on them.
So the first 6 months, they did their factor and nothing else. And then they stopped their prophylaxis with a factor, and instead they started taking the emicizumab. If they had a bleed during that time, they would treat it with factor 8. Okay. So we saw a significant bleeding reduction. This, you have to take the factor several times a week intravenously. This, you take the emicizumab once a week with a low subcutaneous shot.
Do you have any clarity as to the number of doses it took to stop those 1.5 bleeding episodes?
Do I have the data here? I don't think I have the data in there. But by and large, it was one dose. And what we're seeing is that the bleeds they seem to be not as big and not as severe, and they need less clotting factor to stop the bleeding.
So like one dose of factor would stop the bleed?
And that's what I'm seeing with all of the.
Is that because, why not completely treat with imsonilumab? Why switch to factor 8? Because it's stronger? Because it's stronger?
Well, so if you have a bleed, with the factor 8, you can get to 100%. With the emicizumab, the highest I'm probably going to get is about maybe 30 to 50%. That's why you want to give the factor 8. So, and that's still something we need to consider. When do we need to go to 100? And when is 15, 30, 50% enough? So that becomes interesting when we have surgeries, when we need to pull a tooth, when, then we need to think about at that point, is emicizumab enough? So this is data from all the published trials. We have the black dots, and this is the mean annual bleeding rate. So we have done all of these clinical trials with all these different products over the years. And if you're looking at what their annualized bleeding rate was, how much they bled on average, these are trials in black here with normal half-life factor. These are trials here with the white circles with the extended half-life. But this is to a molecule, and that's what this new molecule is that's being developed right now. Can I prolong half-life even more than what we have right now? So they did that in a mouse model right here, and this is the regular factor half-life, and you see that it had a pretty poor half-life. This is the FC fusion, that's a lactate, so you see there's a better half-life. And this new one in mice seemed to have an even better half-life. So they tried this in humans, and this is fresh off the press as of Monday. So this is your regular half-life factor 8. And here is this new molecule, and you see it has a much longer half-life. So this is, after a week. So this is a week after you give it, your trough level is 5.6%. So if you take this once a week, you stay at a great trough at all times. So this is once a week factor 8 infusion. So it looks very promising for a factor 8 infusion potential. So just wanted to introduce you to that. There is something longer half-life in the works. And then I wanted to just have a couple of slides just to talk about gene therapy, because that's the ultimate cure. And as we're developing and getting excited about all these wonderful things, how close are we to cure of hemophilia? Can that be achieved? So this was a factor 9. This is still relatively early phase trials, but this is now going into phase 3 trials. And they saw the for factor for hemophilia B, but they saw that some people didn't have that great of a response, but we had some people that we're getting levels of about 15%. And now it's very exciting. And they took this a little bit further, and you see these are 7 subjects, but they're now all hanging out at around 30% with gene therapy. So that's a one-time gene therapy, and their liver starts making factor IX. So this is something that's very promising for the future. What about factor VIII? Can we do the same thing? You know, very exciting data, and I don't have to update, I can as a slide, but they got the gene therapy for factor VIII, and the median factor levels, look at this. This is normal. This is completely normal. This is amazing. But if you look at the range here, people went anywhere from 12, this is what week they are, and they went anywhere from 12 to 254. That's a little scary. So I give gene therapy to somebody, and I don't know whether they're going to wind up to have 12%, a little disappointing, better than before, but, or do they go to 254? I don't know if it's lower than right, exactly, so then they went up. So this is, you know, people I'm sure got super scared when they started seeing that. And say, well, in the end, we don't want to wind up having to be on anticoagulation.
Is the N column there, the 7s and the 6s, is that the number of patients that are expressing that massive?
Yeah, so that's the data that was available for them. Yeah. So, but I mean, for factor VIII, this is something that we didn't expect that we could ever get. So I don't have the slide because I couldn't get my hands on it, but this data was updated, and all of these people now, many weeks out, are they're all in normal range. So all these people, the guy here with 20 went up to 50, and the people or the person with 218 came down to 150. So this is super exciting, and BioMarin is now going into phase 3 trial with the gene therapy. So I think with that in mind, for whoever can take the gene therapy, and it might not be for everybody, but I think it's some people who can cure the hemophilia. Yeah.
Does the gene therapy work solely with gene deletions, or can it do gene inversions as well?
Well, it should really be with anybody. Usually, before right now, what we're thinking about, we're taking this and anybody who has severe hemophilia. So they're not expressing any factor anyway. So, and it should work because you're taking a virus envelope, so just the outside of the virus, that loves to go into the liver. So those are the viruses, they take all the virus material out. They put the factor 9 or factor 8 gene in there. Those viruses are super smart, and they know to go into the liver, and that's where we need them to transport that DNA that makes the factor. And then they incorporate into the cells, and those liver cells then express the factor that otherwise you would not be making. Now, how that works in people with inhibitors, we don't know. Because it could be that this is the ultimate immune tolerance, because you're giving factor 8 or factor 9 all the time. So but I think that's still a few years before we know an answer to that.
How does that affect the genetics in terms of a young man who, you know, maybe in his early 20s has gene therapy, essentially is cured of hemophilia, but does his children, does his daughters, I mean, is it still going to
No,
pass?
because it doesn't go into the genes, it doesn't go into the sperm.
Oh, okay. So it cures
So it
him,
remains
but
in the
won't
host.
impact
Yeah,
the-
it's only for them in their liver. They're then forever they're gonna be cured, but the next generation is not.
Oh, well, I think there's pros, I mean, I think that's
How
just
long
stopping.
how long are you seeing expression? And how long are you expecting expression?
Well, that's another good question. So we know that these people are now well over a year. They were 2 years out, and they're seeing good expression. But do we see that they're going to lose the expression in 3 or 4 or 5 years? Possibly. And the problem with this is that you can only get this once. Because everybody who is exposed to this gene envelope, so to the package, will make an antibody response to it the first time they see it. So you cannot give it a second time. A second time, the immune system is going to destroy that one. So this is a one-shot deal.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So there are different envelopes, and then different companies are making different envelopes. These are the adeno-associated viruses. That's the AAV. There's an AAV5, AAV8, AAV2. There are all kinds of different ones. So could you potentially then, if one gene therapy trial doesn't work, go to another one? Potentially. But a lot of us have predisposing, because AAV is a very common virus that a lot of us have been exposed to. So they started these gene therapy trials with AAV2, and they saw that people were not responding to it. Why? Because we as a population have been exposed to that virus and then make an antibody response. So the AAV5 and 8, they saw, not as many people make a response to it, and that works. Now this would be great in little kids because they don't have that pre-existing immune response yet. So if you can give gene therapy to a newborn, that would be great. But do they have a mature enough liver to actually make that factor? Probably not.
What's the optimal age for a gene therapy candidate? Is there one?
I don't think we know yet. No, these are all adults.
Right.
We experiment on the older people first.
That's
So
good.
it's going to be a while before that goes into kids. But this right here made me fall off my chair about a year ago when I saw that. I was going it was at the World Federation meeting, and I was sitting there and I'm getting ready to check my emails because I'm going, this is going to be boring. Factor 8 gene therapy is not going to work. And then I saw that and I said, oh my God,
It's working.
this is phenomenal.
Right. So promising.
So if you were to enter into this trial and say you got 3 to 5 years, that'd be all you'd get. If they worked out the expression issues and suddenly they came up with something that gave you 10 or 12 years or 15 years, you would not be eligible for that particular therapy, correct?
Yep.
Get all your surgery done in those 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, exactly. Plan it out. So and we don't know how long people are going to express, and maybe this is going to be expression for the rest of their lives.
Right.
And that's pretty
Only time will tell.
How about other forms of introducing it versus a virus? Like, well, Vicki and I did a project on it with like lettuce and milk and just other ways.
So the lettuce is an interesting. So that's what World Health is working on in Florida. So this is super interesting. But he is doing this. You can't get the gene therapy into the body. So what he's doing is he's introducing factor to people just eating it as a form of immune tolerance. So if you get exposed to little factor 8 every day, but you don't have to inject it, but you can just eat lettuce.
Freeze dry.
Anyway. So he initially did that, and he actually did it in tobacco plants, and mice were getting tolerized, but they had to eat a lot of tobacco. so he said, well, maybe that's not good if we want to give that to little kids, and then he figured out how to get the factor 8 gene into the lettuce.
So in theory, could you start a 3.5-year-old with severe egg vitamin inhibitor that's tolerized now? Could he have gone on an asizumab, immediately eat some lettuce, just in case, until he gets a and then have his 1 dose of...
Yeah, so this is the next also really important question. So we know that emicizumab works in people with inhibitors, but what do we do with that inhibitor? Are we still trying to get rid of it? And if we don't want to do traditional immune tolerance with the factor 8 every single day, can we eventually have people eat these letters? Actually, no, they're not. They now condense them in little green pills, but it's the same idea as like, can you then get tolerance? Because I think we don't want to, if we can get rid of an inhibitor, we want to get rid of it. And then the question arises, so if we have somebody who's done immune tolerance and they're tolerized, what do? We keep them on factor 8 because we want to continue to expose them and say, hey, stay tolerant. What happens if we would just stop the factor 8 thing? And how much factor 8 do we need? once a week, once a month. I think an oral form would be great. So I'm really, really keeping tabs on what Roland is doing. And I think it's very promising. Well, can you give the factor 8 substitute to these are, this is not, also not updated, there are now a lot more people that have gotten gene therapy trials, but just this is just to show there are a lot of gene therapy trials out there right now. There are a lot of companies that are trying to explore that, and they're starting to go into these phase 3 clinical trials, and a phase 3 clinical trial is the one that is hoping to get approval of a drug. So we're getting closer, and I think we're going to see this as an improved reality. What that's going to cost, I have no idea. How much should gene therapy cost? $1 million? $2 million?
An article published at 1.5.
1.5 to 2.
Yeah.
So we'll see, and in 1.5, and then you lose the expression a month later. Who's going to carry that risk?
Insurance companies don't like that.
The insurance companies don't want you spending 1.5 million of their money and then switching to a different insurance company
Right.
next year.
Right,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, but 1.5 is what bypassing agents are costing for on an annual basis, so that
With not a regular factor VIII patient.
oh, that's true.
So, yeah, United Healthcare doesn't want you spending 1.5 of their
Right, yeah, I understand.
thing going over to.
That's what I heard too.
yeah.
And just on that cost measure, the BDFW is running a piece of legislation next year to force the state to start the conversation on how do we pay for emerging treatments. And right now, we know that we're the only state that's looking to do that, to push that envelope, because it's around the corner, and the policy is way behind the science, which just blows my mind, because it's gene therapy, right? Like, how is that possible?
Emicizumab treating inhibitors. So if you have no anamnestic response for a couple of years because you haven't seen any factor VIII and you're in some kind of surgical or traumatic situation, can you just give factor
Yep.
VIII? And
Absolutely. So I think
72 hours like traditional?
No,
or-
it's about 5 days.
Okay.
So I think, did everybody understand the question?
Just repeat it, because he was,
Yeah.
was hurt.
So the question is, if somebody has a factor VIII inhibitor and they can't take factor VIII, usually these factor VIII inhibitors kind of go to sleep if people are not exposed to factor VIII. And if I do expose them to factor VIII again, they will wake up, but they usually take about 5 days before they do. So during that time, when somebody's in a major car crash or they need a big surgery, could we give factor VIII because the body doesn't make that inhibitor for about 5 days. Yes, that's absolutely true. So it's my practice, and I'm pushing that practice to anybody who listens to me, that we need to know the underlying inhibitor level on everybody. So I'm going to continue on your annual visit. You're always going to get an inhibitor drawn, so I know where that is. And if I get a call in the middle of the night, so crashed and has a major head trauma, I know whether I can give factor VIII or not. And the same thing with the porcine factor VIII, by the way, too. So I check a porcine and I give factor VIII. So I know.
to test that, you don't use a standard Nijmegen assay.
You
for
need to
your-
do chromogenic.
Chromogenic.
Yeah, because the emicizumab is going to interfere with that, because you can't do anything ABTT based.
So can you state the age of the expert, like, so if this is approved, what age do we think?
For non-inhibitor patients?
For non-inhibitor patients?
So
Because I've heard different things.
Yeah, so this trial, if you paid attention, the HAVA-3 trial was in people 16 and up. No, I'm sorry, 12 and up. So not for little kids. But the data or the approval request at the FDA is for all ages. How can they do that? They can do that because they already did the kid trial, the pediatric trial in the inhibitor patients, and they saw no safety signals or anything that was different in kids. So with that data, they can go to the FDA and say, well, here's that it works. And with these trials before, we showed that this drug works in kids as well as it works in adults, and therefore it should work. So they're going for all ages.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have been granted expedited review. So I'm hoping if it follows the timeline that it did with inhibitor patients, I'm hoping that we're gonna see approval at the end of the year. Now, what happens at that point, and availability, and what payers are gonna do, and, injunctions will also use.
Paperwork.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, we've done a lot of work with it, so because of the inhibitor patients going first, we've been working with insurance companies, so this is not gonna be a new drug to insurance companies. And I have to say that in the state of Washington, the payers have been great to work with. And so far, everybody has gotten it approved. So that, there's a lot of legwork that's already been done.
Good.
Well, I don't know if this is too off track, but if, how long would you want to see a new patient on emicizumab on it before you took out a port?
From my experience and how little they're bleeding, I usually take, you can take out the port as soon as they have had their 4 weekly loading doses. I won't take to take the port out. And I have taken all the ports in my patients out without anything extra. And I had, so these were inhibitor patients. But they all had their ports removed without any problems. One of them had a little bit of a hematoma, and I gave 1 dose of Novo-7, and they were fine. So the question is, do you need to give anything? Now, the nice thing, if you have a non-inhibitor patient, you just give a dose of factor VIII and makes it safe. Don't need them anymore. It's going to be interesting as, if people are on emicizumab and they're doing well on it, are we going to lose our infusion skills? Do we need factor at home? How much factor do we need at home? These are all questions that.
How is that going to change the HTC if we're coming in for treatments instead of being able to do it at home?
Or does it go back to being an ER?
Well, hopefully not, but we'll see. I mean, essentially, what we're facing is the people that have severe hemophilia can now be turned into mild hemophilia. And somebody with mild hemophilia, how do they infuse factor? Most of them don't know how to do it. I think if somebody's done it all their lives, they probably will remember. I think it's kind of like riding a bike. But my question was, one of my kids was on vacation in Hawaii, and he was on emicizumab, and I said, fine, and take a dose of factor with you just in case. Well, he decides to get a huge ileoceous bleed while he's out there, and he took his dose of factor, but 1 dose of factor is not enough, and now I'm trying to find out some factor in Hawaii. That's always now you can travel so much more easily because you don't have to take boxes and boxes of factor. So now you just you go for a 5-day hiking trip. You take your emicizumab before, but how much factor do you have to take? Not as much as before, but.
So when do you think gene therapy will be coming out?
So the factor, the phase 3 clinical trials are opening, or they have already opened. They're going to take a year or 2 to approve. Then this needs to go to the FDA. I don't know what the FDA is going to say. Are they going to do expedited review for that? I don't know. Are we going to see any problems during the clinical trial? So I would say the earliest I would think about, I'm guessing here, some approval maybe in 3 years, and then there are the cost issues. So,
do you really think that there will be a lot of people who will say, I want it, I want it, I want it? I mean, there's still some folks that are on plasma
it's
drug
interesting,
product.
and you tell me that because I don't know what the answer is. Either do people, this is a permanent change, and people feel a little bit different about that than the emicizumab. The emicizumab's been easy because, hey, you try it and if it doesn't work, you stop it again. But this is You're
permanent.
actually inserting
Yeah.
a gene, and how do you feel about that? And what's the long-term safety, and how much, before you would give that to your son, how much data would you want to have?
And then there was some talk, some religious aspect to it as well,
Well, yeah.
so. It's exciting.
It's very exciting, yeah. Great times for hemophilia. And in about 10 years, I'm gonna have a coffee shop somewhere for the.
I probably missed it, but how, like, readily as accessible would the asciminib be for him? Like, how soon would it be available for someone who's?
Currently, he's about to turn 11, so he's under 12 with that.
Doesn't matter, so they're going for approval for all ages. So
Okay.
once it's, let's say, if it follows the same timeline that it did for the inhibitor patients, we could potentially see approval of it late this year, so November, December. Don't hold me to that, this is, but that's what I'm thinking is possible. Might be early next year, somewhere around there. And then it depends on what the insurance companies are they gonna pay for it? They're gonna say, oh yeah, we're already paying for it for the inhibitor patients, we don't have a problem with it, go? Or are they gonna give us problems?
Does that have more questions for Stephanie there?
Well, I mean, I think Rebecca's pretty, knows how the insurance companies are working on it. I think one of the benefits is that there's this entity called ICER, and they review products, and they say they're a nonprofit, but they're funded by the insurance companies, and they came out with a positive report.
Okay.
I think that,
But that's for the inhibitor.
but for the inhibitor, the
So
thing
we-
that, yeah, the Genentech is that when this product, before this product came out, they couldn't go to places like the state and talk about the cost because they didn't have a drug currently in the market at that time. So in a sense, my understanding is that they're pre-selling. So now that they have a drug in the market, they can start negotiating those things prior to release. So they've been out there. I also have been pleased to see, unlike the gene therapy companies, is that they are investing millions of dollars on the policy end of this, because some of it has to do with whether or not how, we'll just use the state for example, defines the word factor. So for the Washington Center, or for how factor is paid for in the state of Washington, we are lucky it says bleeding disorder products. So they can just slot ME in that, where some states say factor use, and then they have to go back and argue with the state or the drug company or the insurance company, is this factor? Well, it's not, then where do we put it? Under medical, pharmaceutical, like, so that it extends the conversation.
Okay.
So.
Would this be considered a replacement, supplementary,
I think it's
as
just
far
another
as
drug line.
treatment goes?
Yeah, so I mean, right now they're letting it go under factor replace. So that was a big discussion. Is this gonna be a medication, non-medication? Where's this gonna fall? Because under insurance coverage, that matters very much how the reimbursement works. So far, everything has been worked out very favorably. So it can continue to be reimbursed under kind of the same idea as factor.
So here in our state, you mean like Washington Medicaid, they're paying for it as a factor
There,
replacement.
exactly, yeah. So, I mean, the state has been really great to work
That's
with.
awesome.
They've been fantastic.
Good.
They wanted to get informed, they wanted to know what this is about, they wanted to understand, they looked at the data, they were open for discussion.
We're lucky.
Yeah, yes.
And then I think that we can always do some pre-work, so as people look at their plans or that comes up, is that, so I have access to the person for this, that works with all the insurance companies. So if you have a company, I'm happy to email them and saying, hey, I have a patient that's looking at this pre-approval, how is this working with this company, what do you think? You can start those, all we can do is start the conversation, they can either say yes or no, but it's just like with any of the other products where the drug company is willing to intervene. And I think as questions arise, or you have just thoughts, right? Like you're trying to figure this all out, letting us know so that we can go help provide those resources. I think it's helpful for me, and I don't know about Rebecca, but definitely for me, if you guys come to me with the questions, then I can definitely go look for them. I don't ever want to look like I'm favoring one product over the other, but this is all access issues, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
and
common-
we want to make sure that everybody has a choice.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not saying that this is the end all or anything, say whoever wants to be on it, absolutely, you know, here's the data, this is what it is. But we want access to choices. We're still in the pharmacy, we're gonna cover, we're still gonna have everything. And two more things, I mean, one important thing is that any drug company gives us a copay assistance. That's really important for all of you, because if you have deductibles, if you have copays, and that can be $20,000 a year, and who can afford that? Nobody. So we want to make sure that, and Genentech does have that for the emicizumab, which is great. Very important, otherwise, you know, it can be out there, but if it costs you $20,000 a year, you can't do it. So that's an important thing. And an important thing, and that's just kind of throw in the mix, how is it reimbursed if we are selling it through the hemophilia treatment center pharmacy? Because this is how we're a hemophilia center. We are providing care to everybody, but that needs to be funded. And that is funded because we have this pharmacy. So if the reimbursement through this pharmacy is not going to be given anymore, then we need to close the hemophilia.
And that's where we differ a little bit, right? So I'm access, and then the treatment center works on there.
But and again, I have to give it to Genentech there too. They worked with us and made sure that they went into pricing. So that basically just means they give it to us at a little bit of a lower price, so we can have a little bit of a margin when we sell it, so we can support the care for you guys. Any other questions?
And then, I think too, as I spend so much time thinking about what this could look like in the future, I think another good point at some point, once it's approved, is how do patients go about making up that appointment? Because what if it's, you know, my clinic, Ethan has an appointment in November, it's approved in December, but you want an appointment again, so how do we, how should patients work with you guys on all that? I think that's just something we can talk about in the future to help.
Well, I mean, I think as we get closer to it, we know it's gonna get approved, and let's say, we're never gonna know what date it's gonna be approved. It's just one day I get that happy phone call from whoever, but it's usually as we're getting closer. I mean, I already started talking to all my patients who are coming to comprehensive visits and say, this is something that is probably gonna happen in the next year. Should we wait until the next comprehensive visit, or we'll let you know when it's out?
They were really pretty right on with the inhibitor deal with analysis.
Just be like, cancel out.
Well, but in December, so if it follows at all what it did for the inhibitor patients, so by November it was approved, but in December I had no insurance company that was prepared to reimburse it yet. So it took until January, February before I started switching people.
That's not bad, from approval to
No.
actually in-home use, a couple months.
I mean, it was fast for many, many reasons, but there are a lot of things in line that were thought of before we said, well, let's make this transition.
So I'm guessing, I mean, you don't push any of the pharmaceutical companies or anything like that. But I'm guessing multiple ones have already taken part in this or that. When it becomes available, there will be several choices.
No, so the emicizumab is only made by Genentech right now.
Okay.
We know that there's another company who has a bispecific antibody. I have no idea whether they're going to be exploring that or not. Do I think that there will be other companies that are, or there are other companies that are potentially already working on something like that? No, when the first factor VIII came out, there was only one. And how many do we have today? So I'm not convinced that this is going to be the only company that's going to have a bispecific antibody. And maybe the next company is going to make one that has much higher affinity, and you're going to get better efficacy. I don't know.
So each
Okay.
company has to have their own kind of
Yep.
makeup. They can't copy whatever Genentech is.
No,
Theoretically.
that's when you have lawsuits.
Okay.
It's a very complicated
I'm
landscape.
sure. Okay.
So, no, we'll see. Competition's good.
Competition breeds excellence.
Exactly. So, thank you. Yeah.
It's good in our insurance tells us subject
Any more questions?
No, but I have to say, I learned so much today. Thank you
You're
so
very,
much.
very good.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
It is exciting.
This is, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So I think you already answered this question, but I just want to make sure I understand it right. So with the patient that went through immunotherapy before and successfully adapted with factor VIII,
Mhm.
so
Yeah,
when they go into that new treatment here, so it's like you said, once of a while, it's better to get another dose of factor. So
That's what I'm thinking. So
Yeah.
although there are different categories of inhibitors. There are those that have an inhibitor, you give them immune tolerance, that inhibitor goes away and it never comes back, whether they get exposed to factor VIII again or not. But then there are the people that have these inhibitors and they just don't quite go away. They kind of go away, but if you don't expose them to factor VIII anymore, it comes back. So if you have somebody with a persistent inhibitor like that, I would always want to expose them to some factor. So, but I think that's where we still have to consult with everybody individually and see, this is how you've been behaving, and based on what I know about you, this is what I think the future is going to look like, and therefore I think our approach should be so and so. So before I open my coffee shop, maybe I'll
I was buying coffee there every day.
In HAVE 1 and 2, we saw a big difference between the pediatric patients
Yeah.
and the number of treated versus the adult
Yeah.
patients. Was that data similar in 3 and 4?
So in 3, so the question was that the bleeding data was very different in the inhibitor trials for the adults versus the pediatric patients. Because the adults already came in with a lot more joint damage and target joints, and they had more bleeds, the adults did, than the little kids. We saw next to no bleeding in the little kids on emicizumab, but they didn't have any joint damage to begin with, so they didn't have as many target joints. Question is, how did that pan out in the non-inhibitor patients? The non-inhibitor patients, we don't have any pediatric data.
Oh, yes, it was 12.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you even tease it out from, like, say, 12 to 18 or 35
Probably
to 45?
could, and I haven't seen that data yet. Is it in the publication that's not out yet? Probably some. Now, if you don't have as many target joints, you're gonna do overall. Yeah, and the Haven 4 just looked at the every 4-week dosing to make sure that, and that's also in adults.
So one of the things that we've been talking about with the parents with young kids is when prophylaxis was severe, there's a sense of comfort knowing where your kid is versus just cruising at mild, which can have more questions sometimes. Do you think that this will maybe be an age change?
Well, I think it's so what, hemophilia has us trained in thinking about peaks and troughs.
Yeah.
Right? Am I at peak? Can I do CrossFit or something crazy like that? No, but can I do a higher risk activity where I know I just took my shot, I'm at 100%, I'm okay. Is that good enough when you're cruising at 30% all the time? That's the, where's the comfort level? So do I think that there are some people that are going to stay on factor VIII for a while because they're super active? Do I see that I have somebody who goes snowboarding, high risk snowboarding, every day in winter. Would that be somebody who's better served when they're going, if they take a factor every day before they go out snowboarding? Maybe. So, but then there's this so much more convenient, and I don't have to bring all this factor with me. So I think people are gonna tell me where they, my function is to discuss, these are all the options. This is what life looks like here, or here, or here, what's important to you, and what is best. I am not taking factor 8 off the table. There are certainly people that are gonna be doing better with continued factor 8.
Think so?
Something, you know, like I said, you know, if I have this kid that's doing very high risk sports every day, is he better off on everyday factor prophylaxis? Because I know I get, right before he goes out, I know I'm gonna be at 100%. On MSs, I can't guarantee that, and I'm not gonna do both, because that is not responsible economics. Well, exactly, and then if you have that extended half-life factor, you know, how does that fit in? But, you know, if you get to 100%, but by day 3, you're only at 30%, is that then enough? So, yeah, I think it's just everybody is different, especially in this population. Everybody has a different activity, they have a different bleeding tendency, and you just offer all the options and say, well, it's the best plan.
Super exciting.